Cool. All right, so I think we are recording. All right, so look, thanks again, everyone, for coming today. So we're going to get started now. Um, Today, we're here to talk about, well, in another series of the Bastion webinar, creating the right culture for startups and creating a successful culture in a startup environment. Thanks again for everyone for coming and joining us. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get into the content. Can I have all the attendees raise their hands if they can hear me? I just want to make sure the audio is working. Yep, yep, yep. Okay, cool. All right. So we will be doing, so the session is going to go such. I'm going to give a quick intro. Hiam's going to have a bit of a conversation around her business and culture and some building blocks that we can all learn from. And then we're going to have a bit of an open dialogue and a Q&A session with Julian and Luke. Now, I would encourage everyone to, on the Q&A button here on the webinar, if you have any questions you'd like us to discuss, to contribute to that. And there's also going to be some poll questions that we're going to be running through this as well. There's 3 poll questions just to kind of give some interaction in the webinar. Yeah, so without further ado, I wanted to start off actually with a poll question because it'd be interesting to understand why is everyone here today. So I'm just going to launch this first poll question. And so it is, which of these do you identify most with? I'm a startup founder or a senior leader interested in the content. I'm a team leader, manager interested in how to infuse startup culture. I'm a director. I'm a people and culture practitioner, or I'm just a curious person who finds the topic interesting. So we'll give that a couple seconds here. Right, okay. Almost everyone has voted. Okay. And okay, I'll stop it there. So I think over half of the attendees are startup founders or senior leaders who are interested in how to create workplace culture. Okay, well, that's great. So look, I would hope that this is some very valuable content for you then. And if you're not a startup leader or a startup founder, then that's fine too, but interesting to see those. So you can see the results here. Okay. All right, so let's get into this. So for those who don't know myself or Bastion Consulting, I'll give you just a quick intro. So Bastion Consulting, we've been around for actually 3 years this month now. I didn't even realize until I actually got prepared for today. So we do senior exec search work across the APAC region, based here in Sydney, but have worked in almost all of the major markets across Asia for a number of years. I myself, I've been doing exec search work specifically in supply chain, but it's fed into other functional areas like finance or IT or anything else. Actually done a few HR roles on the odd occasion as well. So typically retain senior search work that we do. And so that's just a little bit about us. Now, in terms of who we've got here today with us, first of all, I just want to introduce Hiam Sakakini. She is based here in Sydney. She is the founder and CEO of The Culture Equation, which is an advisory business specializing in creating and changing culture for success. She's worked with companies like DHL. She also spent 9 years at Google, both in the UK and ANZ, where she worked on creating leadership behaviors, cultural development, and coaching for the executive and leadership team within Google across the APAC region. So she's got some really interesting insights to share with us. We've got Luke Wood. Luke is also based here in Sydney. Luke is the CEO of Escavox. This is actually his second startup, which is an IoT fresh food technology solution business. Prior to Escavox, Luke was with Woolworths in a number of roles. He finished off as the head of supply chain systems and strategy. He's worked for companies like Sainsbury in the UK, and his first startup was TrigPoint Solutions in the US as well, which he helped co-found and was successful for about 7-8 years, I think it was. And then our final speaker that we've got today, and not last but not least, is Julian Brun. Now, special thanks to Julian. Julian is actually in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, and it's 7:07 in the morning. So he's been gracious enough to get up and have his coffee at a very early time. So thanks for doing that, Julian. Julian wears a couple hats right now. So he is the founder and managing partner of CEL Consulting, which is a supply chain and tech advisory business, specifically in the emerging markets in Asia. He is the chairman for La French Tech Vietnam, which is supported by the French government, which is essentially a technology community and some focuses around health tech or green tech specifically. And then he's also the founder and president of EID, which is a startup accelerator in Vietnam as well. So I do think all three of our speaker and panelists today have interesting and valuable insights into culture and creating business success that I think everyone will enjoy. So now in terms of, actually, I want to launch another question, sorry. So poll question 2, I wanted to ask quickly. So I'm going to launch this before we talk about why today. So building the right culture is hard. Which of the following would you emphasize first in order to lay the right fundamentals for success? So I just want to see what everyone thinks there. Here we go, voting in. Okay, transparency, defining company values. I was going to think transparency was going to win, was going to be the primary focus or the emphasis, but it looks like, all right, I'll stop that there. It looks like defining company values and staying true to them is the biggest thing everyone would focus on as a starting point for fundamentals for success. Okay, interesting. So why this topic? Now, look, here at Bastion and myself, I don't have 10 years of primarily working with startups. So it's not necessarily in terms of our core demographic initially, but where I do see this topic coming up more and more is, you know, we work with leaders, not only executives in the supply chain space, but multiple functions across. And more and more, especially over the last couple of years, I've had business leaders give examples or talk about either leaving the corporate world to try the startup lifestyle and the startup culture. They get approached because of their domain expertise to join a startup, or they have a really interesting idea and hence they want to try to build something themselves. So I mean, there's lots of encouraging and exciting reasons to get involved in startups. And I've had this story, you know, countless times with professionals at an executive level who are interested in doing this type of work. So I feel like it's coming up more and more. And certainly, you know, people talk about digitizing business now. That's an overly used phrase, but certainly people getting involved in these environments is more and more interesting for everyone. And so for me personally and for Bastian, I thought it was an interesting topic because of the frequency of conversation we're having. The other reason was I myself had some experience working with a startup a couple of years ago, and I actually had to learn some really hard lessons. So I wanted to just give a quick background on that. Now, there was a startup in Asia. I won't share the name, but I had known, you know, one of the founders before they started the business, this startup. And when they started the business, when they got the tech up and running, and they had it in a few different markets, they approached me about starting to recruit some roles for them to help them find some talent. And it all sounded great, started off really well. We had a couple placements and some success. And then they approached me about exchanging recruitment fees for equity shares, for equity in the business, which I thought was at the time an exciting proposition, right? Because none of my other clients had offered me equity into their business before. And I believed in the product, right? I think, and I still do to this day, I think the product has a lot of merit. But there was a real contrast between being a supplier and then going and becoming essentially a minority owner or an equity holder within the business. And once you got to lift the lid and actually look at the engine and look at what's happening internally, there was a stark contrast as to what's communicated externally and what's communicated internally. And so for me, that was a really interesting lesson to learn. You know, the transparency in communication, it was essentially a culture of do as I say, not as I do, right? And so there was a lot of discrepancies in behavior, an exceptionally under-resourced leadership team, I won't go into some of the details, but there was just a lot of opportunities for improvement. I wouldn't say negative cultures, but there's a lot of lessons learned that I took from that I've kind of held on to as well. So my experience working in that environment, combined with my candidates always a lot more frequently talking to me about culture and startups and is this the right idea for me? Should I be doing this? Oh, this is really exciting. I thought it'd be valuable to give back and bring these three panelists on here to kind of talk about their background and what they've experienced and some of the lessons they can that we can learn from them essentially. So yeah, so that's kind of why we're here today. So I think I've done enough talking, and these three panelists have far more important things to say than I do. So I'm going to pass it to Hiem now, where she can give us a bit of an intro on the culture equation, and then talk us through some interesting learning she can share with us.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Tony, and thanks for bringing a great group of people together, both the panelists, which I can't wait to hear more of their real world stories after I give just a brief sort of outline of three key things that I think are very core to creating a positive startup culture. And also, you know, the audience here, I noticed some names on there that I actually recognize. They're great founders themselves. So I'd love to obviously hand it over at any point to them to ask questions or share stories as well. So a little bit about the culture equation. We are a organization that, as it says here, you know, specializes in supporting large organizations to develop high-performing cultures. And we define that as empowered teams who trust each other and who can innovate their way through challenges and who deliver excellent customer experiences. And so this is the kind of stuff that we specialize in that you've listed there. And I'll go through a few more things as I go through these key ingredients, three critical ingredients, and also some common pitfalls. So a bit more background on me. As you mentioned, I used to work at Google. I was there for 9 years. And this is the place that actually piqued my interest in workplace culture. Back when I joined, it wasn't considered, you know, anything interesting as a company. It was not very well known. In fact, I think I listed it number 7 on a list of 10 companies that I wanted to work for. And I applied for all of those companies at the same time. And I started going through the interview process at the same time. It's pretty methodical. It's actually how their interview process, how their recruitment process worked, which made me really curious about this company. So they put about a quarter of the attention on culture fit, which was, they were out of those 10 companies, that was the only company that had any sort of a test for culture fit in the interview process. And so when I did join, I made it a point to really understand what is it that they're doing differently when it comes to this culture thing. How can I learn more about it? And I intentionally moved from the business side into the people and culture side, where, as you say, I ended up heading up leadership development here in Asia. So one thing, if you skip on to the next slide, yeah, exactly. One thing they were really good at in Google was they were good at asking great questions. And this is one of the top questions that they would ask, which is, how can we create an environment where people can do their best work? Now, this is again, whether you're a startup, scale up, or a massive organization, this is a really relevant question to ask, especially now. And they weren't just fanatical about asking the right questions. They were, they always wanted to know, well, how do we know? How do we know if we've gotten there? How do we know if this year is better than last year? How do we measure? What are the key things that are important to measure? And what's changing as things like what's happening now change? What do we change in terms of how we measure those sorts of things? So one thing that other companies now ask me is, you know, how do I create a culture like Google or like Spotify or like Atlassian? And Luke, you mentioned last time we met that this is just impossible. You can't copy paste a culture. But I do believe in those key ingredients. There are some things that we can make sure are in the mix, and then we can see what pops out at the other end. So pitfall number 1 and ingredient number 1, as everybody here kind of pointed out, it's the values. If we don't start with the values, and if the values are not lived and breathed. So number 1, if we don't have any values, if we've just gone straight into creating a product, launching it, and let's see, you know, if it works, then we're in trouble down the track. And then if we create values, but we're not paying attention to whether they're actually being lived and breathed, we're actually in even more trouble. So Gallup has done a bit of research on this. Only 10% of companies live their values.
Oh,
And that directly relates to exactly employee engagement, which in Australia is at 14% of employees in Australia that they have surveyed say that they're engaged in their jobs. And
is
say that again?
sorry, Hume. It just came to thought. Is that 14% of employees are engaged? Is that low based on in comparison to other markets? That seems low to me. I'm not sure what the barometer for success is. What's an effective number, but that seems
Yeah.
quite low, isn't it?
It is. I can send a link around about what this looks like, you know, versus other countries. And but that's people who are saying I'm highly engaged in my role, right? So there are there's a scale there.
Yeah.
And one of the big variables is managers, obviously. So when you have a really good values-led organization, you have leadership who role model those values. It sounds simple, but it's actually really hard to do. When you have leadership that role models those values, for example, Tony, in your case, if transparency was one of those values and it was role modeled, you wouldn't have had the issues that you had.
Yeah.
Then you have an engaged team. And if you have an engaged team, they are usually really customer focused. They have great relationships with their customers. They solve customer problems. And therefore, you have very loyal customers. And so the virtual cycle begins again and is reinforcing. So without great values, if you skip on to the next slide, you will fall apart eventually. That's my belief. And not only having the great values, but having them embedded throughout the employee life cycle, which we'll talk about in a minute. So if you want a good example of values, have a look at the Atlassian website. They not only have the values laid out, and I personally think 5 is max, the number that you should have. But when you go on there, you'll notice there's a really detailed description for each one. What does good look like for each one of these? And there's the video, which is narrated by one of their co-founders. And what you'll also notice is just like restaurants and hotels these days, workplaces are rated. So if you look at Glassdoor, which is a workplace rating website,
Yep.
you can look up how people feel about companies that they've worked with, how they rate them on various different scales. And the first one is around culture and values. So you can see how Atlassian is rated on that particular one. And you'll see plenty of comments as well, which bring those ratings to life. So I'd encourage you to have a look at Glassdoor in general to see what's important to employees these days. And that's how you can maybe work back from that for your own organization. So that's key ingredient number 1. And as I say, throughout all of this, throw some questions into Q&A, which we can chat about at the end. On to number 2 in terms of pitfalls, which is wrong senior hires. So I noticed this particular post on my LinkedIn feed not so long ago, maybe 2 weeks ago. And it was really interesting. This is a partner at a VC firm. He's based out in Dublin, and I used to work with him back in Google. And they surveyed 175 VC-backed SaaS companies and found that over half of them had gotten their first senior hire wrong. So I messaged him and I asked him, what was it? Why? What happened? And he said 2 things. One is they're not sure what good looks like when it comes to those head of roles. So the head of marketing, the head of engineering, or if they're moving into a new territory, that local GM role. And that's again back down to your culture fit. So you want to hire for skills. People know what that looks like. You want to hire for those values and that culture fit. And you want to hire for will as well. So just because somebody has achieved something in the past doesn't mean they're necessarily excited about doing it all over again in the future. So really pushing for those 3 things during the interview process and testing for it. The other thing that they found, the second thing, was that they had no networks on the ground to actually create a pool of candidates if they are moving into a new territory. So if they're moving from startup to scale up. And obviously, Tony, this is where people like you come in. So having those good contacts makes a big difference. And a lot of them hadn't used recruiters. So that's an important thing, having a good candidate pool. So if you skip on to the next slide, here's some questions I believe you should ask yourself, especially when it comes to recruiting for culture fit. How are we sourcing candidates? Do we have a diverse pool? Remembering that unconscious bias starts here. How are we structuring the interview process to test for culture fit? Are we being really rigorous at this? How are we verifying culture fit? So even though they've maybe got through that interview process, what about the actual behavior that shows up in the first 6 months? And are we really willing at that point in time, if we do see those behaviors come through that are not congruent with our culture, are we brave enough to say, no, this isn't going to work out?
Mm.
So that is number 2 in terms of key ingredients. Get those senior hires right and make sure they're the right culture fit for the team. Then when you've got those senior hires right, I would imagine that costs a lot of money. I am always surprised at how little organizations invest in bringing that team together. So you have these amazing people, all very specific skill sets, all exceptional at what they do. But we know they're going to go through this, team formation period of time where they're very polite at the outset in that forming stage. And really all they need at that stage is a little bit of direction. But then every team falls into storming. And these are where, there's maybe some power struggles or some conflicts that emerge. And this is where coaching is really important. Then you move into norming, and this is where agreements are made and things are starting to come out a little bit better. And this is where facilitation is really important. And then performing. And this is where we acknowledge achievements. And this is also where we need to continuously improve and see what's working, what's not working, and refine as we go. So again, coaching, really, really important here. So this is a big pitfall, I believe, in a lot of organizations. They don't invest in this stage of team formation, especially for executive leadership teams or that founding team. And it's so important. And a lot of founders ring me when this is not going well. And just to remember that when you bring a new person into that team, you go back down to the forming stage again. So this is continuous. It's not like we've got to the end and that's it. So that's something that I think is important to invest in.
Yeah. Hey, Him, sorry. Is there a typical time frame as to, when you can expect the transition from a forming to a storming, norming, and performing stages? Or is it essentially every situation is unique and it has its own timeline?
People are messy. There is no, I wish there was a real formula that I could say, you're just about to go through from stage 1 to stage 2. So,
yeah.
But you could be stuck in storming for a very long time if you're not acknowledging and having some really brave conversations.
Okay.
Which is onto the next slide, actually, which is where I really think it's important to really invest in those conversations. As Brene Brown says, you either attend to fears and feelings, or you're going to squander a lot of time trying to manage ineffective and unproductive behavior. So this is a book I love and I think is worth reading. And definitely, as I say, you could get stuck in storming for a very long time if you're not really aware of these stages and investing in a coach to push you through. Every team, including sports teams out there, they all invest in coaching, but it's amazing to me how few business teams do. So there you go. If you go to the next slide, we've just got a quick recap before I hand it over to Luke and Julian to maybe talk about their stories here. I feel these are the top 3 ingredients. I mean, there's thousands more, but these are the ones that I think are really common across all stages of organizations, but especially for startups to create the right startup culture.
Yeah, okay. Well, thanks for that, Ian. That was great. So look, before we jump into Luke and Julian, I think we're going to run our and look, so sorry, just before we get to the next poll question, for everyone attending, there will be some content that we're going to share post the webinar with some assets and information from him, but also from Julian and from Luke as well. So this will be shared to everyone post today. So the next question I just wanted to ask everyone is essentially, so the shift from large corporate MNCs to a startup can be a huge adjustment. Which of the following areas is the hardest to adjust to? What do you think? The lack of internal resources, budget constraints, the need to wear multiple hats, the day-to-day operational pace and speed, or the lack of clear direction? So we'll just give it a second here, let everyone vote, and then we'll bring in Julian and Luke to talk about their experiences, and then we'll have a bit of a Q&A and go through and try to learn as much as we can from those guys. Okay, so give it a couple more seconds. All right, so we'll stop there. So we had the need to wear multiple hats and move across multiple functions as the biggest adjustment. I think that's fair because essentially in a startup, from at least from the lessons I've heard or the stories I've heard, is you essentially, even though your title is A, you can probably be doing A, B, C, D, E, F, G as well. So, okay. All right. So let's go to Julian and to Luke. So I guess what I'd like to do here first, Luke, if you wouldn't mind giving us just a bit of an intro on yourself in terms of the startup experience, and then we'll do the same with Julian. And then I've got some areas I'd like to talk about. And if there's anything you guys want to share in terms of, horror stories or successes or anything in between, feel free to do so as well. So Luke, I'll pass it to you first. You just want to give us a bit of a background in terms of, what you've experienced in terms of startups, your background, and we go from there.
Okay. Good morning. Thank you. So Escavox is my second really big formal startup. I run a business in the US as well. And both of these businesses, I've also set up a small consulting firm, but I'm not sure that really counts. Both of them have been as an output. I've come from a more corporate structure and moved in and started businesses to go do it. So I've made the transition from corporate to startup twice. And both times I've sworn I'm never doing it again, but I keep getting pulled back for whatever reason. My businesses are predominantly based in the supply chain arena and in technology. But the experiences have been very, very similar when you dial back and look at the overall picture. And in talking to Hyam just recently this week and listening to a talk this morning, you give clear structure and the framework to what, I've always viewed as very important. And as I look at, our path through investment and through startup has always been important, but maybe not verbalized. People don't talk about the framework. So we often hear expressions like, investors will back the founder, not the business. Investors are keen to know about the team and the board. And what they're really saying is they're obsessed with that culture, that ability to go and do these things. And I spend a lot of time talking about it. We're really sensitive to the team of it. And so to me, it's funny. I think you mentioned on there, Google put 25% cultural fit. For us recruiting, we would be much higher than that. We've got teams right now. Escavox is currently 2 years old. We're a team of about 15. The cultural fit for me is probably closer to 60, 70% because it's so sensitive. And one of the key questions that we ask people joining our business is not only, do we talk about our culture, but what are you going to bring to it? How are you going to change that? How are you going to adjust that dynamic? Because when you're small like a startup, not only do you want to infuse your culture in people, but they're big enough to affect your culture too. So you've got to be really sensitive to it. When you're a business of 100 or 150, the delta shifts a little bit. So it's really, really important for us. But then we also notice it's a bit like having a really good waiter. Really good culture should be there. It's an intrinsic part of it, but it should be natural. You shouldn't feel it. You shouldn't have to constantly talk about it, because it should be inbred as to what you're doing. That's when, to me, successful culture and successful attitude is it happens, but you're not constantly saying you need to go do. So it's a really odd balance, but you only get there by talking about it in the first place. So it's a fascinating space for me. It is absolutely a priority when I recruit. I'm working with a recruitment agent right now as we're filling a couple of senior roles. And I was very clear telling him earlier this week, in fact, I'm going to let my team decide the technical skills. I will interview purely for culture. That will be, my input will be, do they fit with our business as a whole? So to me, it's a fascinating journey. I'm 2 years into my second startup. We've gone the very traditional way. I've raised private equity. We've started with, big ideas and small, powerful teams. And our biggest challenge is managing some of the ego with some of the budget, and how do we align that and get it going? But, we're going okay. So my first business we sold 3 weeks after its 10th anniversary.
10 years.
10 years. And, you know, the first year's really hard. So first anniversary is the big one. Your third anniversary is the next yardstick, and then your 10th. So we got our first one to its 10. We're in our second one at the moment. So we've cleared our first hurdle, and we're racing towards our third.
Great. Thanks, Luke. So Julian, you want to give us a bit of a tech summary in terms of what you're doing and your experience in this environment?
Yeah, just briefly, I've been actually lucky enough to land in Vietnam 15 years ago, and I'm still there. I was flying for a couple of months of trip. 15 years after I'm here, there's many reasons for me to be here, and the part of it is entrepreneurship. This is probably, to my view, it's a paradise for entrepreneurs. So much opportunities, access to quite qualified people for very decent cost, and an eagerness to innovate. That's the environment that you are in when you're in Vietnam and when you want to start a business. So it's quite favorable. Now, myself, I've been quite early in setting my own company, as it was a consulting firm, much easier to set than anything else. You got a business card yourself, and you got a company basically. And once it starts to need for expansion because you got more and more business, then you start to realize how much culture is important and how much cross-cultural culture is difficult. When you have to adapt a bunch of French guys, Vietnamese, German, Australian, American, and that fit is not that obvious as you may guess. It's actually quite tricky to quickly adjust, so you don't get groups of Westerners and Asians and people all over the place having clans. Basically, this quick clan setup is quite difficult to counterbalance with, bringing people together and setting this culture of cross-cultural culture is part of a culture for a company that needs people from all over the world. So my own experience has been mostly this company, and lucky enough, consulting is good to get into various projects, various companies. Most of our clients are multinational companies, so we understand the environment in which I've run away from, because I started in multinational companies when I started my career, and it gave me a nice feel that I would not be working as an employee for these companies, and they became my clients. I'm very happy now because I can still experience quite high level interaction with senior executive, but at the same time have the flexibility of shifting to a direction I feel most relevant. On the side of this company, I've created spin-offs. What I use mostly CEL for now is to start spin-offs. Spin-off being mostly software related. So projects, supply chain project, improving a supply chain gives us an idea of how can inventory could be optimized, for example. And then the next project seems to be a bit the same. So we go into innovation through a quick software development, and then we start to have a product very quickly, and then we create a side business and try to push this product in the market. So this has been my experience in creating startup from a mainframe consulting firm. Now on the side, I've been engaging into EID mostly. I'll talk about French Tech later, but EID is an accelerator, and for me it was an amazing experience because you start seeing young, fresh companies, sometimes very fresh graduate coming up with a pitch deck and saying, I want to make a revolution in the retail sector. I said, right, and then you start to learn from very young, fresh people with amazing ambitions and probably not a clue of what they're doing, and quite some experienced entrepreneurs that have failed over and over, and that give you also a perspective on how to succeed in at least in the Southeast Asian environment. So that's been my background. Now, culturally, I can maybe I'll leave the discussion going, but one of my key challenge has been, and I think it's a massive, it's a harsh problem for young startups when you are, as Luke said, when you're a small team, you bring someone new, and that it can really mess up your culture or really enhance it. And this, you need the right skill set. If you got poor technical level at the beginning with your core team, you end up having a shitty product very quickly that you need to reinvest in to make it proper. So you need very strong skill set, very strong people technically, but they need also to match very well with you personally. So you have a personal match score and a technical score that need to be very high, and that obviously to find those people in at least in this part of the world is a massive challenge. So there's a compromise to do here. I agree with Luke. I prefer I prefer focusing on the personal side, and sometimes compromise a little bit the technical because the culture to me has more impact than somehow some technical shortfall that you may later compensate.
Okay. Oh, look, that's great. Thanks, Julian. So one of the things I wanted to ask all three of you, because you've all been in big corporates and your own business essentially. Now, Ian talked about setting the right values at the beginning to help create a culture for success. What's the process of actually defining values? How do, like, in terms of each of you, I'll ask each of you to answer this question, but defining values, but what's the process of going about to define the values that are important to you? Is it simply just getting a piece of paper and writing down the 3 or 4 most important things for yourselves? Or how did you guys each go about doing that? Who wants to go first?
I can start for you.
Sure.
You have to have a very honest and open conversation with whoever you're starting the business with. It's to me that simple. It's not wildly different to any relationship. You've got to be able to put your cards on the table and say, this is what's important to me. And there's a presumption point for me that says, if you've had the idea and you've taken that first step, whether it's, handing in your resignation or setting the company up or doing whatever it is, there's a set of inherent values that you already have. And all you're really doing in that first conversation is writing down what you know and making sure that aligns with your partners and the team that you're stepping with. Me, it should not be hard. It should represent what you know and how you act. There's a level of maturity. You need to understand yourself and what's important to you. And where I've seen it go wrong is if you write them down as aspirational rather than what you actually do. So don't write something that you want to be. And this is my point. Don't sit in a room and go, I want to be Atlassian, therefore I'll copy theirs, because you don't understand what's driven them to get to theirs. You've got to have a really honest process with yourself and your partners to go, this is what's important to me. Share that and make sure that it's important to all of you. And it shouldn't be hard. And it's as simple, Tony, as sitting and writing them on a piece of paper or a whiteboard or whatever it is. My first business took a bit of time to get to. The second business, when we do it with Escobox, I kid you not, it took us about 5 minutes to agree the values and about 3 hours and 4 bottles of wine to agree how to write them down.
Well, that sounds okay. Interesting. Thanks for that. Ian, what are your thoughts on creating the right values? How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, absolutely agree. It comes down to, first of all, exploring your personal values, what drives you, obviously, and then how does that connect with that founding team, and how do you then crystallize that and make it easy for people to understand? So not overthinking the language sometimes is something that I notice teams do. They have that core and then they try and, corporatize it or make it a bit more, formal. Just try and stick with that original language, and it actually will come through even more authentic to people who are checking you out and potentially going to apply for roles. So I think that's one thing. Another thing that I really challenge organizations to do is really think through. So if these are your values, what are you going to notice behavior-wise when these are being lived? And what would you notice? Give me some examples of behaviors if people are not living these values. And even more importantly, if you notice that kind of behavior, what are you prepared to do about it?
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, okay. And Julian, how did you go about setting up the right values for CL or any other venture?
It took me years, to be frank, because it came along with knowing myself. So and it's as you said, look, it's really maturity related, and I've seen so many startups, young fresh startups, 20, 25 years old guys, very promising, but they had not much clue. They kind of listed a bunch of things they found they find fancy, but they could not relate very much to it. So I believe setting your own values comes particularly with a partner with
Mm-hmm.
very transparent discussions, honest discussion. Um, but it takes a bit of time, and I kind of reviewed a few times. Also for a reason that in Asia, English might not be sometimes is a bit of a problem with some technical people particularly. And rephrasing or rewording have been an effort that I had to do for simple reason that people didn't get the word. Integrity, for example, is not something very easy to understand for people that have an average level of English. I got a recent case of a staff that was thinking that responsiveness is actually relating to being responsible. So you have to bring things at the most simple level. So
Mm-hmm.
there's no question, there's no ambiguity, and so on. And that effort of simplification is sometimes necessary when you hire abroad, beyond Australia or beyond the Anglo-Saxon world, I guess.
We had a question from one of the attendees. It was for you, Luke. What you mentioned by partners, do you mean investors as well, with respect to open conversation about values?
Yes, I never have a problem having an open conversation if anybody ever chose to ask me about the values, because they shouldn't be, they're not something that should be hidden. They should be something you stand behind, and they should be absolutely paramount to what you do. And so I don't include them in any of my investment decks, for the record. I don't feel the need to stand up and say, these are my values, because that should become apparent in how my business operates.
Yeah,
And
okay.
really, so if people ask me, absolutely. But having a few buzzwords on a slide don't really make much difference to me. The reason we use them internally, and I will discuss it with investors, is if there's a shift, or if that would send me strategically in one direction that they might not. And I think it's worth pointing, though, and just listening to Julian talk there as well, there's a difference between values and behaviors. And values are a genuine value, but we all might behave differently representing that value, but as long as we're going for the core value. So no, Richard, I would absolutely share. I'm no problem sharing. It's a core part of what we do and who I am, but I don't necessarily promote them, because that should come through in the work that we do.
Yeah, okay. And so again, we're talking about setting values and talking about what to do. I guess I would like to ask each of you, and you can answer it in your own unique way. What about regrets or lessons learned, or things you would have done differently in starting a business? Because each of you have started your own business now, so I mean, you don't have to share intimate personal details with the specific example, but can you give us an idea of maybe something that you did that you probably wouldn't do again, or you would try to avoid next time? Luke, you're laughing. You want to start?
Yeah. If you haven't got regrets, I don't think you've been starting up properly.
Yeah, fair.
Oh, look, there's 1,000 decisions, with hindsight, you go back and change. The biggest one, which I continue to learn to this day, is you've got to trust yourself to some degree with what you're doing and where you're going. And I think we've all done it. And it doesn't matter whether you're in a startup or not. The difference in the startups is it plays through. If you know somebody's not right, if you know the deal doesn't feel right, you might not be able to quantify every element of why it feels wrong. But at some point, you've got to trust that feeling and back yourself to do it. And that's really, really hard to do, because you're in a new space, or it's a new market, or it's a new team, or it's a new investor. The biggest thing I really struggle with is that at what point do I not trust myself to do this? Do I seek too much advice? Every really major decision that I truly regret, I already knew long before we were there that it was the wrong thing. and I didn't back myself to make it when I should have done.
Okay, that's a good answer. Ian, what would you say starting the culture equation? What was your biggest learning or biggest regret or lesson learned?
Well, actually, this is my second stab at it since leaving 3 years ago. So, and exactly that, issue, I think, is what I ignored the first time around. And look, I started the first organization with a wonderful person who I was, previously, a colleague with, and we started as co-founders and 50-50 partners. And in hindsight, it was the wrong decision. And you go into a partnership like you do a marriage. And I feel like I didn't really do the dating part maybe as best as I could have. And so it fell apart. And it's one of my deepest regrets. So yes, I think really if you're going in from a co-founder point of view, partnership point of view, really think that piece through. Think about it from the points of view of, what are the very different skills that you bring to the table? What skills would be missing? What's your expectations of each other? What are your own personal goals outside of the business? And how could this business get in the way of those personal goals being achieved? So those types of things are things we probably should have thought through and talked about more.
Sure. And Julian, what about you?
I support, and I'm well aligned with what you said, guys. But to complement to add to the debate, I think hiring too fast has been one of my recurring mistake. When you have maybe it's contextual, I don't know, but when you have opportunities all over the place, you need someone to help and push a certain project or things that you need now, and you actually don't take the time to hire. So you kind of take shortcuts and you end up losing or failing the project because you got the wrong people. And that hire fast type of thing has been quite of a pain because I had to double the effort after the failure. And that kind of learning has been painfully learning it. But it's been one of the biggest regrets, and it's not about one or several people. It's really about having urged the decision too quickly and not really taking the time to find this match I was talking about.
Sure. Okay. So I think we've got one more question here, and then we'll probably wrap it up. So one of the panelists has asked, they've started their own startup about 5 years ago. They had set some values back at the beginning. And they've added and changed team members and feel like the culture has shifted. Have you experienced that? And if so, how did you manage that? Who wants to take a stab at this?
So, yes, I have, but it's less about when we did some work, we grew my previous business. And in fact, we're kind of going through it right now with Escobox. Is you typically go through a growth phase. You bring in either influential people or powerful people or seniors, or call them what you will. At that point, what I've noticed is my values didn't change, but the behaviors and the implementation of them did.
Okay.
And what we kind of did was, it was worth going back to reset some of that, because if you do, you get this nice, comfortable, strong team, you get used to working in a certain way. And as new people join, it just erodes. And as you say, over 5 years, it shifts. And it's definitely worth revisiting. And if the team's grown and maybe your client base has grown, and certainly if my business is anything to go by, the solution that you thought you're going to do is completely different. You've all learned, you've all changed and matured. So it's probably worth revisiting. It would be interesting to see if your values have really changed, or just your implementation and sort of exhibition of them has changed.
Yeah, okay. Ian?
Yeah, I mean, on this one, I really feel like you can create values, but again, are they being lived and breathed? Which means, are they being used on a daily basis to make good decisions? Mm-hmm. Are they being used to make hiring decisions? Are they being used throughout the onboarding stage? Are they being used to make promotion decisions? Who do we promote and who do we not promote? Firing decisions, for example. All these sorts of things are ways you can infuse your values throughout the life cycle of an employee, and therefore there shouldn't be a real need to completely, revisit and reset them. They're constantly being reinforced day in, day out. So that for me is the key there.
We had an additional question just come through, and it ties to the first one, so I'll keep going with this. It's the secondary question was, what's the most effective way to revisit them as well? Like, I know there's no formula or equation to do this. There's no specific one way, but is there any kind of lessons or experiences that any of you have had around revisiting culture or resetting culture or values in the business?
I would be shamelessly plugging Chaim's work here. Learn how to have a coaching conversation with people.
Yep.
And learn, and it's a definitive skill, and it's one that I'm constantly working on, but learn how to have that conversation, because it may be as simple as a conversation. It may be more formal, but it will start with a really good coaching conversation.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. Well, look, I'm just conscious of time, so we're just about on an hour here. So I think we'll probably wrap it up here, everyone. So I wanted to say thank you to all the attendees today. I do appreciate your time to spend with Chaim, Luke, Julian, and myself today. That was great. And to all the panelists, I do appreciate your time and energy and effort to support this process. It was great. Really enjoyed the content, and I hope everyone did too. So have a great Friday, and enjoy the weekend. We'll talk to everyone soon. Take care, guys. Cheers. Bye.
Thank you. Cheers.